You're watching Sky News. Now then, Ukraine's president has visited the border area with Russia for the first time since Ukrainian forces crossed over into the Kursk region. Let's get more on the situation in Ukraine. Our military analyst Sean Bell is here with us. Talk to us about these latest developments then.
Yeah, good afternoon, Gareth. It's been interesting that because this is a secret operation by Ukraine in the north, trying to get information is quite tricky. We're hearing all sorts of counter conversations. Russia saying they're pushing the Ukrainians out, Ukrainians saying they're still expanding. At the moment, it looks likely that Ukraine is just expanding slightly. Ukraine has been blowing the bridges, as we've known. Russia's now been building pontoon bridges to try and cross. Ukraine has been targeting those. But frankly, up in there, we've heard of no major muscle movements over the last 24 hours.
And this is this hatched area up here, is it?
That's the hatched area just above you there, yes. The main area fighting down the Donbas, we're focused on down here. Clearly, what the Russians have been doing, pushing very hard toward Pokrovsk down here, down in the south there. The Russian forces are only about 6 miles away from that now. We're hearing that Ukraine is actually evacuating its people from the area there, and they're expecting the Russians to move in on there. And we're also understand that about a third of the Russian effort on the front line is actually in that one part. It's pretty clear where they're focusing their efforts. If we move even further south as well, we reported the other day about Rostov, about the Ukrainian drone attack on a Russian oil facility. That was a few days ago. It's still blazing. And to put it into context, there are 20 of the 74 fuel storage areas there on fire, over 500 firefighters. So it's a very dynamic battlefield at all. The one question that comes to mind, though, is what is the Ukraine strategy at the moment? Why are they doing all this stuff? Looks very likely they've blown the bridges in the north. They're going to stay in the incursion. They're going to stop the Russians pushing out. They've said they don't want to stay there and hold the ground. What they're trying to do is force President Putin to respond. Here is some of the action that's happening. We've got video footage of the Ukrainians actually operating in the Kursk region. And by embarrassing Putin, forcing him to bring battle-hardened troops, easing the pressure on the front line.
So we can see there they've dug in, they're using mortars, for example, in this instance. They don't want to hold this ground long term. So how does Putin react to this?
Yeah, that's the big question here. The first response to that, which we expected for the last couple of weeks, was that President Putin is Mr. Security. This is the first time Russia's been invaded since 1941. He'd be deeply embarrassed. He needs to deal with it. He knows he's got Ukraine battle-hardened troops in there, so pulling them in from Kaliningrad or Crimea doesn't cut it. He really needs to move troops from the front line here and deal with it ruthlessly. And of course, that's probably what Ukraine wanted. That's not his only option, though. The other option, of course, that he has available is that Donbas is the main effort for him. He's now got up to 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers, probably battle-hardened, that are now fixed well away from the front line. He can largely leave that and deal with this in the south. And therefore, because Ukraine is limited in resources, he knows it's going to be potentially an easier job in the south and therefore deal with that later. In fact, some of the Kremlin messaging has been justifying why President Putin is not dealing with that now, but pushing here. The other spin-off, of course, is Ukraine is desperately short of manpower. It's done a mobilisation. More of the soldiers being brought in with limited training, conscripts, potentially not as robust on the front line. And we're hearing that they're not as robust and therefore potentially contributing to some of the advances that are being made. The one thing that's interesting as well, when Ukrainians made that incursion, we wondered about the fate of General Gerasimov, the leader of the Russian army, humiliation, blame somebody. If this is the main effort, and this prevails, General Gerasimov is probably safe, at least for now.
Do you think then, just briefly, that this was a mistake on the Ukrainian part, not the incursion in itself, but the fact that the messaging around it indicated their objectives? Would it have been better to have moved into that space and been ambiguous about what you wanted to do with it, to try and draw some of these troops, like you've been saying?
I think that's the question that will linger for the next few days and weeks. I think when you're in the middle of an operation, it's very difficult to make a judgment of whether it was an error. Initially, we thought it was an audacious act. Then we went, actually, it could be an inspired act. We've got to wait and see how this plays out. There's only 10 to 12 weeks of before winter settles in and fighting becomes very difficult. It looks very likely at the moment the President Putin is going to use that 10 to 12 weeks focused on the front line here and deal with that in the fullness of time.
Fascinating stuff, Sean. Thank you so much. And just a reminder, of course, you can always get the full story first here on Sky. We'll follow those developments closely.